There is a ghost that haunts the memory of the 20th century. It is not the specter of a single man, nor the echo of a single battle. It is the ghost of a child's face, unnaturally old, smeared with the grime of urban warfare. The eyes, which should be filled with the light of youth, are instead alight with a terrifying, manufactured fanaticism. In his small hands, he clutches not a toy soldier, but a Panzerfaust, an anti-tank weapon almost as long as he is tall. He is 12, perhaps 13 years old, standing amidst the skeletal ruins of Berlin in the spring of 1945. He is the final, horrific product of a meticulously designed machine, the last line of defense for a regime that had already decided his death was more valuable than his life. This boy is the endpoint of a story, a tragedy that began not with weapons and war, but with summer camps, sing-alongs, and the seductive promise of belonging. How does a nation do this? How does it take the universal, innocent yearning of its children for purpose, for community, for adventure, and twist it into an instrument of its own destruction? This is not merely a story of political indoctrination. It is the story of the systemic, calculated, and ultimately successful poisoning of an entire generation. It is the story of the Hitler Youth. To understand the creation of this monstrous organization, one must first understand the ground in which its seeds were planted. The Germany that emerged from the rubble of the Great War was a nation humiliated, disoriented, and deeply fractured. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed not just economic ruin, but a profound psychological wound, a sense of collective shame. Into this void stepped the Weimar Republic, a noble experiment in democracy that few Germans truly believed in. It was a period of dizzying social change and political violence, of hyperinflation that made life savings worthless overnight, and of a bitter struggle between the far left and the far right. For the older generation, this was a time of disillusionment, but for the young, it was a time of desperate searching. German culture had a long and powerful tradition of youth movements, the most famous being the Wandervogel, or Wandering Birds. These were non-political groups, born in the late 19th century, that idealized nature, folk traditions, and a romantic escape from the suffocating confines of industrial urban life. They hiked through forests, sang old songs around campfires, and sought a spiritual connection to the German homeland. They craved authenticity, community, and a sense of shared destiny that the fractured adult world could not provide. This existing culture of youth organization was the fertile soil. The Nazi Party, in its early, brawling days, recognized this immediately. If they were to build a 1,000-year Reich, they could not simply win the votes of the current generation. They had to capture the hearts and, more importantly, the minds of the next. Their first attempt was a modest affair. In 1922, the Jugendbund der NSDAP, the Youth League of the Nazi Party, was formed. It was little more than a junior version of the Sturmabteilung, the SA, the party's thuggish paramilitary wing. Its members were the sons of early party loyalists, teenagers steeped in the same violent rhetoric and street-fighting ethos as their fathers. But this was a niche group, one among dozens of competing youth organizations. There were the Catholic and Protestant youth leagues, the Boy Scouts, the socialist and communist youth groups. Each offered its own vision of community, its own set of values, its own uniform. For a child in Weimar Germany, choosing a youth group was akin to choosing a political and spiritual identity. The early Nazi youth group was simply another option, and not a particularly popular one at that. It was disorganized, poorly funded, and lacked the widespread appeal of the more established religious or romantic movements. The dream of a monolithic youth movement loyal only to Adolf Hitler seemed, in those early years, a distant and unlikely fantasy. The turning point, the moment the fantasy began its transformation into a horrifying reality, came not with a single event, but with the appointment of a single, ambitious man. In 1931, Adolf Hitler, sensing the untapped potential, appointed Baldur von Schirach as the Reich youth leader of the NSDAP. Schirach was a young, foppish, and ardently devoted Nazi. He was not a grizzled street fighter, but a pseudo-intellectual who saw himself as a poet and a romantic visionary. He understood the appeal of the Wandervogel tradition and knew how to fuse its romanticism with the iron-hard ideology of National Socialism. He saw that the key was not just to command the youth, but to seduce them. He replaced the thuggish image of the early Nazi youth with a more appealing one. Bonfires, camping trips, vigorous physical activity, and the powerful, intoxicating feeling of being part of a great national rebirth. He presented the Nazi Party not as a political faction, but as the ultimate fulfillment of every young German's deepest longings. This was a critical shift, but the true catalyst was yet to come. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The levers of state power were now in his hands, and Skyrach was given his mandate: conquer the German youth completely and utterly. The process that followed was a brutal and systematic campaign of cultural destruction. Skyrach, now armed with the authority of the state, unleashed a policy known as Gleichschaltung, or coordination. It was a euphemism for forced assimilation and annihilation. On April 5, 1933, a contingent of 50 Hitler Youth members stormed the Berlin offices of the Reich Committee of German Youth Associations, the umbrella organization for nearly all non-Nazi youth groups. They seized records, intimidated staff, and declared themselves the new leadership. It was a hostile takeover. Over the next few months, one by one, every other youth organization was either forcibly absorbed into the Hitler Youth or banned outright. The socialist and communist groups were the first to be smashed, their leaders arrested. The Protestant youth groups were pressured into a merger, their religious identity slowly hollowed out and replaced with Nazi ceremony. The Catholic groups held out the longest, protected by the 1933 Concordat between the Vatican and the Reich, but they too were eventually harassed, intimidated, and squeezed into irrelevance. The Boy Scouts were simply declared incompatible with the National Socialist spirit and disbanded. By the end of 1934, the Hitler Youth was, for all intents and purposes, the only game in town. The landscape of German childhood had been irrevocably altered. The rich tapestry of different groups, with their different beliefs and traditions, had been replaced by a single, monolithic entity, clad in brown shirts and black shorts, marching to the beat of a single drum. With all competition eliminated, the Nazi state began the real work: the construction of a conveyor belt for the soul. The system was meticulously structured, designed to capture a child from the cradle and not let go until they were delivered, fully formed, into the arms of the party, the Wehrmacht, or the SS. At the age of 10, a boy entered the Deutsches Jungvolk, the German young people. Here he took his first oath, not to God, not to his country, but to a man. Standing before a blood-red flag emblazoned with a swastika, he would raise his right hand and recite the words: "In the presence of this blood banner, which represents our Führer, I swear to devote all my energies and my strength to the savior of our country, Adolf Hitler. I am willing and ready to give up my life for him. So help me God." From that moment on, his life was no longer his own. He was given a performance book, a Leistungsbuch, where his physical and ideological progress would be obsessively tracked for the rest of his youth. His days were filled with relentless activity: forced marches, war games, boxing, and endless drills. He learned to read maps, handle a small-caliber rifle, and throw dummy grenades. He was taught a twisted version of history in which Germany was a nation of blameless heroes, betrayed by Jews and communists. He was subjected to lectures on racial science, learning to identify the supposed physical traits of the subhuman Slavs and Jews, and to see himself as a member of the superior Aryan master race. For girls, the path was parallel but distinct, designed to mold them into their designated role in the Reich, bearers of future Aryan soldiers. At 10, they joined the Jungelbund, the Young Maidens League, and at 14, they graduated to the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the BDM, or League of German Girls. Their curriculum also emphasized physical fitness, with gymnastics, sports, and long hikes. They were taught to be strong, healthy, and robust, not for their own sake, but for the sake of the collective. Their motto was "Be faithful, be pure, be German." While the boys were being prepared for war, the girls were being prepared for motherhood. They learned domestic skills, hygiene, and eugenics, taught to select a racially pure husband and to raise a large family for the Führer. The propaganda was relentless. They were told that their bodies did not belong to them, but to the nation. The highest honor a German woman could achieve was not a career or personal fulfillment, but the Mother's Cross, awarded for bearing numerous children. Yet, beneath this veneer of domesticity, the BDM also served to toughen girls, to strip them of feminine weakness, and instill in them the same fanatical devotion as the boys. They too were part of the machine, crucial cogs in the creation of the new Nazi society. The most insidious part of this system was not the physical training or the overt propaganda, but the deliberate and systematic destruction of the family unit. The Hitler Youth was designed to be a surrogate family, one whose authority superseded that of any parent. The traditional bonds of love and loyalty were actively undermined. Children were taught that their first and only duty was to Adolf Hitler. The home, once a sanctuary of private life, was turned into a potential outpost of the state. Hitler himself made this goal chillingly clear. "Your child belongs to us," he proclaimed. "What are you? You will pass away, but your descendants, they now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community." The organization created a wedge between generations. Parents who had grown up in a different Germany, who retained a sense of skepticism or a belief in different values, were now viewed with suspicion by their own children. The Hitler Youth Patrol Service, the Streifendienst, acted as a sort of internal Gestapo, encouraging members to report on any signs of dissent or disloyalty, even within their own homes. A father's grumbling remark about the government, a mother's decision to listen to the BBC, a pastor's sermon that deviated from the party line, all could be reported by a zealous son or daughter. The psychological pressure was immense. How could you discipline a child who could threaten to report you to his unit leader? The state had inserted itself into the most intimate spaces of German life, turning children into informants against their own parents. The ancient commandment to honor thy father and mother was replaced with a new one. The Führer is your father. Germany is your mother. Of course, not every child was a willing convert. There was resistance, though it was scattered and dangerous. Some parents simply forbade their children from attending meetings, risking official reprimands and social ostracism. More organized resistance came from groups like the Edelweiss Pirates, working-class teenagers in cities like Cologne and Essen who rejected the militaristic conformity of the Hitler Youth. They grew their hair long, listened to forbidden jazz music, and sometimes engaged in street brawls with Hitler Youth patrols. They represented a stubborn flicker of individualism in a world demanding absolute uniformity. More famously, the White Rose movement, led by university students Hans and Sophie Scholl, had its roots in a disillusionment that began in the Hitler Youth. Hans had initially been an enthusiastic squad leader, but he became disgusted by the blind obedience and the suppression of free thought. Their resistance, however, was intellectual and ultimately suicidal. They distributed leaflets urging Germans to oppose the regime and were caught, tried, and executed in 1943. For the vast majority of German youth, however, resistance was unthinkable. The Hitler Youth offered everything an adolescent craves: a powerful sense of identity, camaraderie, adventure, and the intoxicating feeling of being part of something larger than oneself. It was their entire world, the only reality they knew. Critical thinking was not merely discouraged. It was engineered out of existence. Obedience was the highest virtue. That was a crime. The curriculum of hatred had devastating real-world consequences long before the war. The constant anti-Semitic indoctrination bore its ugliest fruit during the Kristallnacht pogrom in November 1938. Hitler Youth members were not just passive observers. They were active and enthusiastic participants. Encouraged by their leaders, teenagers who had been taught for years to despise Jews as parasites and enemies of the German people were unleashed onto the streets. They smashed the windows of Jewish shops, burned synagogues, and dragged Jewish families from their homes, beating them in public. These were not seasoned SS thugs. They were boys aged 14, 15, 16, acting out the lessons they had learned in their weekly meetings and summer camps. They had been trained to see this not as a criminal rampage, but as a righteous act of national cleansing. This was a horrifying dress rehearsal, a demonstration of just how successful the indoctrination had been. The state had created a generation that could be commanded to commit atrocities, not with reluctance, but with glee. They had been taught that cruelty was strength and that compassion for the designated enemy was a weakness. The moral compass of millions of children had been deliberately shattered and reassembled to point only in the direction the Führer commanded. When war broke out in September 1939, the Hitler Youth was immediately mobilized to support the war effort. At first, their roles were auxiliary. Boys and girls organized scrap metal drives, collected winter clothing for soldiers on the Eastern Front, and served as messengers and air raid wardens. They were the home front soldiers, and propaganda lionized their contributions, showing smiling, rosy-cheeked children happily doing their part for the final victory. BDM girls worked as farm laborers to replace the men who had been conscripted and serve in hospitals as nurses' aides. As the war dragged on and Allied bombing raid intensified, the roles became more dangerous. Teenage boys served in anti-aircraft batteries, the so-called Flakehelfer. Stationed on the rooftops of German cities, these 15 and 16-year-olds, still officially students, were now operating complex artillery pieces, firing at waves of British and American bombers. They lived in barracks, wore Luftwaffe uniforms, and experienced the full horror of aerial warfare. They saw their friends killed, maimed, and incinerated. Their schooling became an afterthought. Their childhood was now entirely militarized. The promise of adventure had been fulfilled, but it was an adventure of terror, exhaustion, and death. The deeper Germany plunged into the war, the more it began to consume its own young. The catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, particularly after Stalingrad, created an insatiable demand for manpower. The age of conscription was lowered again and again. By 1943, entire graduating classes of the Hitler Youth were being funneled directly into the Waffen-SS, the armed wing of the party. A special division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was formed, composed almost entirely of 17-year-old boys, with NCOs and officers drawn from veteran SS units. These were the most fanatical, the true believers, the prized pupils of Skyrac's decade-long indoctrination project. They were sent to face the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. What they lacked in experience, they made up for in a ferocity that shocked even seasoned Allied soldiers. They fought with a suicidal disregard for their own lives, convinced by years of propaganda that surrender was the ultimate disgrace and that death for the Führer was the highest honor. They committed numerous war crimes, murdering Canadian prisoners of war in cold blood. But their fanaticism could not overcome the overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers and firepower. In just over a month of fighting, the division was decimated, suffering over 60% casualties. The flower of the Hitler Youth, the generation bred for victory, lay dead and broken in the fields of Normandy. This, however, was not the end. It was merely the prelude to the final, most grotesque act of the tragedy. As the Red Army advanced from the east and the Western Allies crossed the Rhine in the west, the Nazi regime, in its death throes, made a final, desperate gamble. In the autumn of 1944, Hitler ordered the creation of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. It was a national militia, a last-ditch levy of every male between the ages of 16 and 60 who was not already in the military. In practice, this meant drafting old men and young boys. The Hitler Youth became the core of this new force. The line between child and soldier was erased completely. 12 and 13-year-olds, who just years before were being enrolled in the Jungvolk to play war games, were now handed live weapons and expected to fight a real war. They were given a few hours of training, often just a brief demonstration on how to operate the Panzerfaust, a simple, single-shot anti-tank rocket. They were told that their youthful fanaticism and pure hearts were a secret weapon that would turn the tide against the soulless, materialistic hordes of the enemy. It was a cynical, murderous lie. The final months of the war, particularly during the Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945, descended into a scene of apocalyptic horror. The city was defended by a motley collection of exhausted Wehrmacht remnants, foreign SS volunteers, and the Volkssturm. At the heart of this defense were thousands of Hitler Youth boys. Foreign journalists and advancing Soviet soldiers described with a mixture of pity and revulsion the sight of small children in oversized steel helmets, huddled in foxholes, waiting to confront Soviet T-34 tanks. They fought with the program fanaticism they had been taught, ambushing tanks from ruined buildings, often being obliterated in the process. They were used by desperate commanders as messengers, running through artillery barges when no adult would. They were praised by Joseph Goebbels in his radio broadcasts as heroes, their sacrifice held up as an example to a German people he knew was already defeated. In the final days, as Soviet troops closed in on the Führer bunker, one of the last units defending the area was a contingent of Hitler Youth boys. Adolf Hitler himself emerged from his subterranean lair on April 20th, his 56th birthday, to decorate a handful of these child soldiers in the Chancellery Garden. Photos and newsreel footage captured the pathetic, surreal scene. The stooped, trembling Führer, his face a waxy mask, patting the cheeks of boys who would be dead within days, their iron crosses pinned to uniforms that were far too big for them. It was his final public appearance, a final act of grotesque theater in which the architect of their corruption posed as their benevolent father figure, sending them off to die for his failed vision. When the surrender finally came on May 8, 1945, Germany was a nation not only in physical ruins, but in a state of profound psychological collapse. For the surviving members of the Hitler Youth, the world as they knew it ceased to exist overnight. The Führer they had sworn to die for was dead, a suicide in his bunker. The ideology that had formed the entire basis of their reality was declared a criminal enterprise. The swastika flags were torn down, the slogans were silenced, the uniforms were burned. They were the Hitler Youth, and suddenly that was a mark of shame, not pride. The Allied occupation forces were faced with an unprecedented problem. What to do with millions of young people who had been systematically trained to be fanatical Nazis? The Hitler Youth was outlawed. Its leaders, including Baldur von Schirach, were arrested and put on trial at Nuremberg. Schirach was found guilty of crimes against humanity. His defense, that he did not know about the extermination camps, was dismissed. The tribunal declared that he had poisoned the minds of millions of German children. His sentence was 20 years in prison. But imprisoning the leaders was the easy part. The real challenge was the process of denazification for the rank and file. For many of these young people, the end of the war brought not relief, but a terrifying emptiness. Their entire system of belief had imploded. Some remained defiant, forming clandestine werewolf resistance groups that were quickly suppressed. Others fell into a state of deep cynicism and confusion. Many could not comprehend the scale of the atrocities committed by the regime they had so adored. When confronted with films of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, the initial reaction of many was disbelief. They dismissed it as enemy propaganda, the same kind of lies they had been warned about for years. It was a slow, painful, and often incomplete process of re-education. They had been taught to despise democracy, to hate Jews, and to worship power. Now they were being asked to embrace tolerance, critical thought, and individual responsibility. For a generation whose individuality had been systematically erased, this was a monumental task. They were a lost generation, caught between a past that was now condemned as evil and a future they were utterly unprepared for. The legacy of the Hitler Youth is a long and complex shadow. It is a story of stolen childhoods, of mass psychological manipulation on an almost unimaginable scale. The men and women who grew up in its ranks carried the scars for the rest of their lives. Some, in later years, spoke openly about their experiences, providing invaluable testimony about the seductive power of the movement and the slow process of their awakening. Others remained silent, burying the memories of their brown-shirt youth in a deep well of shame and confusion. The story serves as a permanent and chilling cautionary tale. It demonstrates how easily the apparatus of the state, its schools, its clubs, its media, can be turned into a factory for fanaticism. It reveals the terrifying vulnerability of the young to ideologies that offer simple answers, a sense of belonging, and a target for their frustrations. The Hitler Youth was not an anomaly of history. It was the result of a specific formula, a combination of national humiliation, economic despair, charismatic leadership, and the deliberate dismantling of all alternative sources of moral and intellectual guidance. We are left, in the end, with that image of the boy in the ruins of Berlin. He is the ultimate victim. He is not a monster, but a child who was molded into the shape of a monster by a monstrous system. His fanaticism is not his own. It was implanted in him. His willingness to die is not courage. It is the final, tragic outcome of a childhood spent learning that his life had no value except as a sacrifice for a man and an idea. He stands as a symbol of the profound betrayal committed by the Nazi regime against its own people, a betrayal whose most unforgivable victims were its own children. The story of the Hitler Youth is a stark reminder that the battle for the future is always fought in the minds of the young. It is a testament to the fact that the first and most essential bulwark against tyranny is the encouragement of a child's right to question, to doubt, and to think for themselves. When a nation robs its children of that right, it plants the seeds of its own moral and physical destruction and populates its future with ghosts.